You probably think you would know if your stress levels had become a health problem. You would feel it overwhelmed, exhausted, visibly falling apart. That is not how chronic cortisol works. The body adapts. The system compensates. The signals it sends are quiet, gradual, and easy to attribute to something else entirely. The stubborn weight you blame on diet. The skin you blame on age. The afternoon crash you blame on a bad night's sleep. Chronic cortisol does not announce itself. It disguises itself as ordinary life, and then the research shows up on a scanner. This is the part nobody tells you. Not because the information is hidden, but because the question most people ask is, how do I reduce my stress? Which is the wrong starting point. Before you can address the system, you need to know whether your system has actually lost its rhythm. And that requires knowing what to look for, in the right order, before the damage has been accumulating long enough to become visible. Before we go any further, do you regularly wake up tired even after a full night of sleep? Leave a yes or no in the comments. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that experience is telling you about your cortisol curve. Here is the simplest version of what chronic cortisol actually means. Your body runs cortisol on a rhythm, high in the morning, low by night. When that rhythm breaks down, two things happen simultaneously. The places cortisol should be high, it isn't. The places it should be low, it still is. The system is not just elevated, it is dysregulated. And a dysregulated cortisol curve produces a very specific, recognizable pattern of symptoms if you know what you are reading. Start with what happens at night, because this is where the broken rhythm announces itself most clearly, and where most people have already felt something without knowing what to call it. Cortisol should reach its lowest point between midnight and 4 in the morning. That nadir, the floor of the curve, is the biological condition that allows deep, restorative sleep to happen. Growth hormone is released during this window. Cellular repair runs. The immune system conducts its overnight maintenance. The brain consolidates memory. All of it depends on cortisol being genuinely, significantly low. When chronic stress keeps cortisol elevated into the evening and through the night, that floor never arrives. The repair window doesn't open. And what you experience is one of two things, or both. The first is the 3 to 4 a.m. wake-up. Not a full waking, necessarily. A surfacing mind suddenly active. Thoughts arriving before you have asked for them. A vague sense of alertness that has no business being there at that hour. This is not insomnia in the conventional sense. It is a cortisol pulse, a small, poorly timed surge that pulls you out of deep sleep during the window it was supposed to be absent from. The research on nocturnal cortisol elevation in chronically stressed adults shows this pattern consistently. The 3 a.m. moment is not random, it is scheduled. The second is the feeling of being tired but wired. You are exhausted, genuinely depleted, but you cannot settle. You lie down and your mind accelerates. You turn the lights off, and your thoughts develop opinions about things that did not matter to you 6 hours ago. This is the cortisol and norepinephrine combination running after hours, keeping the prefrontal cortex activated at the exact moment it is supposed to be handing over to the sleep system. The tired part is real. The wired part is also real. They are happening simultaneously because the molecule that should be ending the day's neurological activity is still running. Most people who experience this reach for solutions in the wrong direction. More melatonin, earlier bedtime, white noise. None of these address the cortisol still circulating at 11 at night. The lock is wrong. The key does not fit. Now move to the morning, because what happens in the first 30 minutes after waking is the single most informative data point your body produces about the state of its cortisol system, and almost no one pays attention to it. In a healthy system, cortisol rises sharply within the first 30 minutes of waking by 50 to 75% above its overnight baseline. This surge is called the cortisol awakening response, and it is not incidental. It drives metabolic readiness, primes cognitive function, regulates immune activity, and sets the height from which the day's cortisol curve will decline. Research has confirmed the cortisol awakening response as one of the most sensitive biomarkers of HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal relay integrity, available without clinical testing. A robust morning surge predicts a steep diurnal decline. A blunted or absent surge predicts a flat curve, and a flat curve predicts everything else on this list. Here is the way to read your own morning response without a laboratory. Pay attention to the quality of your alertness in the first 30 minutes after waking, before caffeine, before screens, before anything. A functional cortisol awakening response produces a specific feeling, a genuine, relatively quick arrival into full presence. Not comfort, necessarily, not happiness, but cognitive readiness, the sense that the brain has loaded its software and is running. People with intact cortisol awakening responses often describe mornings as their sharpest window, even if they find them unpleasant. A blunted response looks different. The arrival into full presence takes longer than it should. The brain feels foggy not just for minutes, but for the better part of an hour or more, even after adequate sleep. Getting moving feels like pushing through something that should not be there. This is not a personality type. It is not being a night person. It is a cortisol curve that is starting too low and failing to rise sharply enough to hand the brain what it needs for the day. People with blunted cortisol awakening responses also tend to report something else. They feel better, sharper, more capable, more human, later in the day, sometimes late afternoon, sometimes evening. This is the inverted curve. Because the curve is flat rather than steep, the evening cortisol that should be declining is still present when the morning cortisol should have been doing the heavy lifting. The system has not crashed, it has shifted. And the person living inside it experiences the day backwards, struggling in the morning, finally arriving in the evening, unable to wind down at night. The research on blunted cortisol awakening response is consistent across burnout, chronic fatigue, and prolonged work stress populations. It is also one of the most commonly missed patterns in standard clinical assessment, because a single blood cortisol test, taken at 9 in the morning, cannot distinguish between a robust peak and a flat line with a slightly elevated baseline. The curve requires multiple measurements to read. A single number tells you almost nothing. Now, the daytime symptoms, because these are the ones most people are already experiencing and attributing to the wrong cause. Brain fog is the one most frequently misattributed. Difficulty concentrating. The experience of reaching for a word or a thought and finding the connection slower than it should be. The sense of mental friction that was not there a year ago. Chronically elevated cortisol reduces functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, and the hippocampus. The prefrontal cortex is managing working memory, decision-making, and sustained attention. When cortisol is chronically high, that connectivity degrades. The hardware is intact. The signal between regions is weaker. What you experience as cognitive slowness is a real neurological change, not a perception, not fatigue, not age. A measurable reduction in the efficiency of the circuits that produce clear thinking. Closely related is the emotional signature of chronic cortisol. The research describes it consistently. Anxiety that arrives without a proportionate trigger. Irritability at small things. The kind that surprises you because you know, rationally, that the thing that just irritated you does not merit that response. A low-grade sense of being slightly on edge that has become the baseline rather than the exception. This is not a personality shift. It is the amygdala, the brain's threat detection region, running with elevated sensitivity because chronically high cortisol has strengthened its reactivity while simultaneously suppressing the prefrontal cortex that would normally moderate its output. The alarm is louder. The volume control is weaker, both at once. And here is the piece that makes the whole pattern self-concealing. The body adapts to this state. After weeks and months of elevated cortisol, the nervous system recalibrates around the dysregulation. The baseline feels normal. The fog feels like personality. The irritability feels like a reasonable response to a difficult life. The 3 a.m. wake-up becomes just a thing that happens. The person is not experiencing symptoms clearly labeled as stress. They are experiencing what they have quietly redefined as ordinary. This is why the question, "Do I feel stressed?" is an unreliable diagnostic. Chronically stressed systems stop registering their own dysregulation. The thermostat that should detect the temperature has been running hot for so long it has recalibrated around the heat. What the research does not yet fully confirm is the exact threshold at which these symptom patterns become clinically significant across all populations. The data on burnout, chronic work stress, and caregiver stress is robust in younger and middle-aged adults. The patterns in older adults, in people with significant hormonal shifts, and in people with prior trauma histories show enough variation that the same symptom profile may reflect a different cortisol pattern entirely. A blunted awakening response in one person and a persistently elevated evening cortisol in another can produce nearly identical surface symptoms. The symptom cluster points toward the system. It does not tell you which part of the system has shifted. This is where testing becomes useful, not as a diagnosis, but as a map. A single morning blood cortisol test, the kind a standard panel might include, is almost useless for reading a dysregulated rhythm. It captures one point on a curve that has meaning only in relation to its other points. What the research supports as the most informative, accessible measure is a multi-point salivary cortisol test collecting samples at waking, 30 minutes after waking, midday, afternoon, and before bed. The saliva test measures free cortisol, the biologically active fraction, rather than the total cortisol that blood measures, much of which is bound to proteins and unavailable to cells. The resulting curve shows whether the awakening response is intact, whether the midday decline is tracking correctly, and whether evening cortisol has dropped to where it needs to be to allow restoration overnight. At-home 4-point diurnal cortisol saliva test kits are available without a prescription in most markets. The practical requirement for accuracy is straightforward. No food, drink, or exercise for 30 minutes before each collection. Consistent timing across the collection day. 3 to 4 consecutive testing days for reliable pattern data, because cortisol varies meaningfully day to day, and a single day's curve can mislead. The pattern across multiple days is what carries the signal. Think of the multi-point salivary test the way you would think of reading a tide chart rather than a single water level. One measurement tells you where the water is right now. The chart tells you whether the tide is coming in or going out, and how far it travels in each direction. The rhythm is the information. The single number is almost beside the point. What the pattern of symptoms and the curve together are telling you is not whether you have been under pressure. Almost everyone has been under pressure. They are telling you whether the system that was built to respond to pressure and then recover has been given enough recovery to maintain its integrity. A system that fires and resets is doing its job. A system that fires and holds, that stays elevated at night, blunts in the morning, flattens across the day, and loses the capacity to distinguish between an emergency and a Tuesday afternoon is a system in need of recalibration. Recognizing that is the first step. And it matters, because the interventions that work for a system running too high are meaningfully different from those that work for a system that has already blunted. Throwing relaxation protocols at a blunted curve does not restore it. Understanding which state you are in is what makes what comes next actually land. If this series is changing how you think about what your body has been signaling, like and subscribe. We will be covering how to actually recalibrate the cortisol system, what the mechanism responds to, and in what order soon.